Lord Seventh
is a priest novel. This is an audiobook made by fans for other fans. Disclaimer. The main couple of the story is made up of two men. If you don't like it, don't listen. Thank you. Remember, subscribe and click the bell to stay updated on all the new releases. Enjoy. Chapter 3. An old friend is still here. He wouldn't have misheard that voice even if he did turn to ash. Bai Vuchang's understated utterance of Helian Yi beside the river of forgetfulness hadn't stirred anything up in him. With so many years passing on top of deliberately forgetting it, that name had been buried in the deepest recesses of his memory, nearly unable to be dug out. He still remembered his voice, though. He remembered his little actions. He remembered that when he placed his fingers on his forehead, he wouldn't be able to stop himself from enacting that habit of slightly brushing his hair away. Those were all things that had apparently penetrated straight into his bone marrow. Sometimes, he thought that if there truthfully hadn't been that undying, unresting involvement he had with Helian Yi way back when, then that Lord Seventh who sat beside the three-life rock for 60 years straight also wouldn't exist. Something like ill-fated affinity could be compared to getting shat on by a bird when going out the door. You could think up every possible way to circumvent it and rack your skull for how to guard against it, but there would always be that bird flying in from out of nowhere like a suddenly ambushing army, and it would nevertheless still clearly identify your head and land a lump of divine crap on it sooner or later. From that point on, you'd have the mentality that bad luck was to you as a shadow was to a body. Jing Qi mentally sighed. Knowing that his breathing frequency had already changed when he had just been startled awake by Ping'an, he refused to keep on faking it and thus opened his eyes. Though the other was only in his teens, he had grown into a promising young man that was just like an orchid or jadeite tree, and he struck the eyes as such. However, Jing Qi felt that this Helian Yi was also, kind of too puerile. The youth noticed that he'd awoken, and the color of anger on his face withdrew in a flash. He leaned over, releasing softness into his voice. "How are you? Do you hurt anywhere?" When he was a human in his first lifetime and had caught sight of that very deeply loved, very viciously wounded person in the past, there would always be a million different feelings welling up in his heart and pounding incessantly. Several hundred years had since passed, however. Upon seeing him right before his eyes again, Jing Qi simply didn't react much at all. He thought, was this how Helian Yi had been to start with? Why, was he feeling entirely unfamiliar? He then mused, my brain was broken to start with. Burn it some more for a while, and I can save effort by melting it down and reconstructing it. Snapping out of it, he suddenly noticed the present scene of a head honcho standing up whilst he laid down, and promptly realized that this wasn't appropriate. He propped his body up, swallowed down spit to moisten his throat, then opened his mouth to talk. "Your Highness the Crown Prince." Helian Yi quickly pressed him back down onto the bed, breaking out into laughter. "You're the one sick here, yet you've mastered how to be overly polite. Lay, don't move." The current emperor had some medium-level shortcomings, such as, not planning ahead, getting a bout of chronic dementia every couple of days, having a burgeoning insistence upon seating his first wife-born son and not his older ones back in the day. The moment his young son Helian Yi was born, he decreed that he was going to establish that not even 1-month-old meatball as the crown prince, and then, for the 10-something years after that, through the crown prince he had personally named to the back of his head like it was nothing, not paying him any more mind. To say it irreverently, the crown prince at present likely had a lesser presence to his old man than the crested mina he raised in his study. To add on to that, Helian Yi had two predator-like older brothers. Second scion Helian Qi had 10 years on him, and the eldest, Helian Zhao, had long since grown his wings. No one placed importance on this two-bit crown prince, and they all took him as another joke of the emperor, following those of great General Parrot, Lady Tutor of Royalty, and Mr. Storyteller Prime Minister. Only Jing Beiyuan, the heir of Prince Nanning that had been raised in the palace since childhood, was profoundly close to him. Jing Beiyuan was young, did not have the guidance of his parents, and had been influenced by his yellow robe-wearing royal uncle that was the national champion of being out of tune, so he had been infected by many out-of-tune defects. Though the two had different ranks and their personalities were on separate poles, they shared a bit of sympathy for having the same ailment. They both had mothers to birth them, but not fathers to raise them. Helian Yi sighed, tucked him into the sheets, and gently pat him like he was consoling a child. I shouldn't say these things to begin with, but don't be too unhappy. The senior prince's passing was honestly a shedding of worldly worries to him. The funereal matters have been handled, so you'll come back to the palace with me, and it'll be no different than it had been before. Jing-Chi didn't make a peep, only quietly scrutinizing the teen's profile. Neither of them had anything to rely on at this time. They grew up in the same place as kids and their feelings couldn't have been described as distant, yet that led to not meeting each other in either life or death later on. Jing-Chi had been surprised to find out that back when he was inertly sitting in wait for this guy beside the bridge of helplessness, that mindset of interwoven love and hate where one couldn't grasp it yet also couldn't let it go had apparently momentarily flickered, then dissipated, leaving a complete vacuum in his chest. Helian Yi witnessed his pair of giant eyeglasses get watery from fever, then looked to be at a loss, unable to resist extending a finger to poke him on the forehead. Beiyuan. Jing-Chi blinked. Ah, right. I know this. What do you know? Helian Yi wasn't sure how to react. Ping An just so happened to come in carrying the medicine bowl then, he accepted it in passing, ordered him to stand in attendance at a side, then held Jing-Chi in his arms himself, intending to feed it to him. A waft of warm breath accompanied the boy's form when he plastered against him. Jing-Chi, not having time to think things through, subconsciously tried to avoid him. He couldn't help but lean back a bit, and his entire body collapsed, an arm raised in front of himself in obstruction. Only after completing that action did he recall that Helian Yi and he hadn't yet had a falling out at this point in time, but were in the era of being close teens, so his tightly guarded posture was really over the top. He could feel his brain getting cooked dizzy, and it was like there was a wad of paste inside it, the memories of his previous lifetime and the circumstances of his current one mixing into a ball. Helian Yi didn't think much of it, though. Watching as he shrank back with a paling face, he merely thought that the boy was refusing to take his medicine, and thus forcefully lifted him up by the nape and smiled. "Why are you dodging? How old are you, to still be scared of drinking medicine?" Jing-Chi hurriedly took the out, quickly making himself look like he was unwilling to drink it because he hated bitterness. His eyes swept over the murky interior of the bowl, then he lifted his head to take a look at Helian Yi, continuing to pull backwards. Helian Yi bowed his head to taste a small sip of his medication, then turned his head towards Ping An. "Go and bring back some candied fruits for your master." Ping An wasn't sure why, but a fear came from within him towards this crown prince who was gentle as a breeze to all. Not daring to chatter, he quickly voiced his assent and brought the fruit over from the side table. Helian Yi cajoled Jing-Chi. "I tasted it, and it's not bitter. It's just a few sips, drink it all up and I'll give you these to eat, okay?" Jing-Chi got goosebumps all over, abruptly coming to understand the phrase "the mind is the slave of the body." He silently grabbed one side of the bowl and drank it down out of Helian Yi's hand. He spoke a few offhand words with Helian Yi, which were mostly the other advising him in roundabout ways and Jing-Chi dealing with it while harboring secrets. There had been some stuff for aiding sleep in the medicine, and a short while after drinking it, he sensed his eyelids getting a bit heavy. Helian Yi sat on the side of his bed, tone gentle. "Go to sleep, okay? I'll keep watch over you until you do, and then I'll go." Jing-Chi thus cooperatively shut his eyes, but his ears caught the other sighing. Naturally, he was aware of why Helian Yi sighed. The Empress had met her demise long ago. The Emperor was interested in everything except governing the country. The eldest and second scions using dogs to bite dogs was their lifelong delight and career, and major officials got incrementally more sharp-wit at their internal strifes while getting incrementally more worthless at their jobs. The amount of useless people there were could make one stare wide, tongue-tied, as they gasped in awe. If Helian Yi really was as he portrayed a gentle, refined good-for-nothing, then that'd be it. Yet, against expectations, he was not. There was no one who was clearer than Jing-Chi on how this man held the vast territory of the country in mind, born preordained to ascend to the apex and uplift both heaven and earth. Sometimes even Jing-Chi suspected that the Emperor, whose greatest joy in his whole life was listening to the feathered fiends in his study mutually cuss each other out, had stepped in a pretty big pile of dog shit to have appointed a crown prince like this. It was silent in the room. The faint odor of incense wafted off of Helian Yi. Jing-Chi was briefly addled, but did doze off, disregarding any consequences, all the way until Ping-An nudged him awake at nightfall. Coated in sweat, his fever had since receded, making him a bit clearer-headed. This was the night of the senior prince's prime 7. All the guests had already sent someone with gifts over, and now all those guests were gone. Filial sons had to keep watch at the funeral hall, so Jing-Chi hastily freshened himself up, wobbling as he stood, but waved Ping-An off when he reached out to support him. "No need, I'm not that hindered. You can go your own way." There was a whiff of a gloomy scent in the hall. At the doorway hung a big white lantern that shook when the wind blew, as if it led straight to the netherworld. The old steward had been waiting there for a long time, having already prepared incense, paper, large candles, and other such items. Upon seeing him arrive, he called for people to get fox fur and have him wear it in the night. Jing-Chi had once been reborn as a fox and suffered the pain of getting skinned, so this thing was real mentally discomfiting to him. It'd be bad to damage the old steward's dignity, though. He could only frown slightly as he obediently remained where he stood, allowing the steward's 2 trembling hands to drape it over his shoulders. Afterwards, his tiny hand reached out and stealthily scratched its surface a few times. "You've suffered, brother," he thought. "I'll burn more paper money for you tonight as an offering, and I ask that you take it, as there's bribery in the netherworld office. Don't be subjected to living in a skin sack like this in your next life." The old steward took Jing-Chi's little hand, brought him up before the funeral tablet, and stooped low. "Junior Prince, do give the senior prince a kowtow. You will be in charge of this prince estate's workings from now on." His elderly face gave off a hint of the helplessness of one's remaining years being like a candle in the wind. Jing-Chi used his hand to kneel down, then compliantly kowtowed a few times to his shoddy father prince whose face he had long forgotten the shape of. The prime 7 was the day a wandering soul came back to accept food sacrifices. He didn't know if that old man of his, who had devoted himself to chasing after his deceased wife, even remembered the fact that he still had a son in the human world, nor did he know if he had returned to being Yang now. Whether he could still see the monsters of the yin world or not, he harbored a little longing for it all on the inside. Though he had no deep affections, coming back to life and seeing some old friends now was, overall great, in the end. At the same time, a boy servant came in to report that Great General Pingzi was paying a visit, and the old steward went to find Jing Qi. He was startled, then swiftly said, "Invite him in, quick." There was actually some excitement to his words. This General Pingzi, Fen Yuanji, was one of not many friends from when the senior prince still lived. Considering that Jing Qi had to call him Shifu, it was precisely Great General Feng that had imparted him the skill of being an amateur. A short while later, a robust fellow walked in with large strides, Ping An jogging along behind him the whole way. Jing Qi knew he was unconventional, so he didn't bow when he saw him, merely smiling with very slight dismay. He remembered quite clearly that Fen Yuanji's destined years of life were soon going to reach their end. Fen Yuanji believed that he was freshly bereaved for his father, so he sighed and reached his big, cat-tail fan-like hand over to pat him on the head. "You've been through a lot." He paid respects to the senior prince's funeral tablet as well. Only then did Jing Qi return the gesture, after which he said to Ping An, "Go bring another praying mat over for the great general." The old steward gaped. "That's..." Jing Qi waved his hand. "There's no harm, just go get it. You may all withdraw. I want to speak with him." The old steward had been the utmost of loyal to the prince's estate his whole life, and was always the most law-abiding. Despite Jing Qi being no more than 10 this year, in his mind, the senior prince had ceased to be, the junior master was one who did what he said he would, so the steward had ultimately not said much before bowing and withdrawing. All that remained in the hall was 2 people and a brazier. Fen Yuanji's butt was seated on the mat. He was a crude man who could only fight battles, so after a while of thinking, he still didn't know what to say. That old boy, Mingj, wasn't of much use when he was alive, he spoke somewhat clumsily. "Now that he's passed, you really have to look after that little papier-mâché body of yours." The corner of Jing Qi's mouth lifted in a smile. He stretched his legs, sitting relaxed on the floor, and idly pulled out some paper money to toss into the brazier. "I'm doing fine, but you're going to leave the capital, right, General?" Fen Yuanji startled, raising his eyes to look at him. "How did you know?" End of the chapter. Stay tuned for more BL.